Welcome. Tonight we are going to talk about Tomoe Gozen. In the mist-shrouded mountains of medieval Japan, where cherry blossoms fell like snow and the clash of steel echoed through bamboo forests, there lived a warrior whose name would resonate through the centuries. Her story unfolds in an era of tremendous upheaval, when ancient clans struggled for supremacy over the islands of Japan, and when the very soul of the nation hung in the balance. This is the story of Tomoe Gozen, a woman who defied every expectation of her time, who rode into battle alongside the greatest warriors of her age, and whose legend continues to inspire to this very day. To understand Tomoe, we must first understand the world into which she emerged. The late 12th century in Japan was a time of extraordinary transformation. For generations, the imperial court in Kyoto had maintained a veneer of authority, surrounded by the refined aesthetics of poetry, calligraphy, and religious ceremony. The emperors and their courtiers lived in a world of exquisite beauty, where the ability to compose a perfect poem was valued as highly as any martial skill. But beneath this elegant surface, real power had been gradually shifting away from the aristocracy and into the hands of the warrior class, the samurai. These warriors, originally employed by the great noble families to protect their estates and interests, had grown increasingly powerful and independent. Two clans in particular had risen to dominate the political landscape: the Taira and the Minamoto. For decades, these two great families had vied for influence at the imperial court, forming complex alliances, engaging in political maneuvering, and when necessary, resorting to armed conflict. The tension between these clans would eventually erupt into a devastating civil war known as the Genpei War, a conflict that would reshape Japan forever and provide the stage upon which Tomoe Gozen would make her mark on history. The historical records tell us frustratingly little about Tomoe's early life. We do not know precisely when she was born, though it was likely sometime in the 1150s or early 1160s. We do not know the names of her parents, though various traditions suggest she may have been born into a family of some standing, perhaps even nobility. What we do know is that by the time she appears in the historical chronicles, she was already an accomplished warrior, suggesting years of training and preparation that must have begun in her youth. In the Japan of Tomoe's time, it was not entirely unheard of for women of the samurai class to receive martial training. Unlike in some other cultures where women were strictly confined to domestic roles, Japanese noblewomen were sometimes taught to defend their homes and families, particularly with the naginata, a long pole weapon with a curved blade at the end. This weapon was considered especially suitable for women, as it allowed them to keep opponents at a distance and compensated for any difference in physical strength. Many samurai wives were expected to be able to defend their households when their husbands were away at war. But Tomoe was something far beyond this norm. She was not merely trained in self-defense. She was a warrior in the fullest sense, skilled in horseback riding, archery, and swordsmanship. The historical chronicles describe her as exceptionally strong, capable of handling horses that other riders could not manage, and able to draw the most powerful of bows. She was, by all accounts, the equal of any male warrior of her time, and superior to most. Tomoe enters the historical record as a warrior in the service of Minamoto no Yoshinaka, a complex and ultimately tragic figure who would play a crucial role in the Genpei War. Yoshinaka was a cousin of Minamoto no Yoritomo, who would eventually become the first shogun of Japan and establish the Kamakura shogunate. But in the early stages of the war, Yoshinaka was a powerful force in his own right, leading armies from his base in the mountainous regions of central Japan. The relationship between Tomoe and Yoshinaka has been the subject of much speculation over the centuries. Some sources suggest she was his wife or concubine, while others describe her as a retainer or companion. The truth, obscured by the passage of time and the limited nature of the records, may have been more complex than any single label can capture. What is clear is that she held a position of great trust and importance in Yoshinaka's inner circle, unusual for a woman in that era, and that she fought alongside him in many of the most important battles of the Genpei War. To understand the significance of Tomoe's military career, we need to understand the nature of warfare in 12th century Japan. Battle in this era was a highly ritualized affair, governed by complex codes of honor and conducted according to traditions that would seem strange to modern eyes. Warriors would often begin a battle by announcing their names and lineage, proclaiming their deeds and the glory of their ancestors. Combat frequently took the form of individual duels between champions, with armies watching as their greatest fighters engaged in single combat. Archery from horseback was considered the supreme martial skill. A warrior would gallop across the battlefield, guiding their horse with their knees while drawing a powerful bow, releasing arrows with deadly accuracy at opponents who were also mounted and moving at high speed. This required years of training, exceptional physical strength and coordination, and a horse trained to respond to the subtlest commands. The samurai of this era were essentially mounted archers, and excellence in this art form was the mark of a true warrior. Tomoe excelled at this form of combat. The chronicles describe her as a fearsome presence on the battlefield, riding at the front of charges, engaging enemies in single combat, and taking the heads of opposing warriors, the ultimate proof of victory in samurai warfare. In an era when personal glory and the demonstration of martial prowess were paramount, Tomoe distinguished herself as one of the finest warriors of her generation. The Genpei War had begun in 1180 when tensions between the Taira and Minamoto clans finally erupted into open conflict. The Taira, under the leadership of Taira no Kiyomori, had dominated the imperial court for years, accumulating wealth and power while increasingly alienating other noble families. When Kiyomori died in 1181, the Taira clan's grip on power began to weaken. The Minamoto, who had been biding their time and building their strength, saw an opportunity to challenge Taira dominance. Minamoto no Yoritomo raised his standard in the eastern provinces, while his cousin Yoshinaka gathered forces in the central mountains. Another cousin, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, who would become one of the most celebrated warriors in Japanese history, would also play a crucial role in the conflict. The war that followed would rage across Japan for 5 years, involving complex alliances, stunning victories, crushing defeats, and acts of both heroism and treachery. Yoshinaka's campaign began with considerable success. In 1181, he achieved a significant victory at the Battle of Yokotagawara, where his forces, despite being outnumbered, defeated a Taira army through superior tactics and the fighting spirit of warriors like Tomoe. This victory established Yoshinaka as a major player in the war and brought him to the attention of the other Minamoto leaders. In the spring of 1183, Yoshinaka achieved his greatest triumph at the Battle of Kurikara. This battle, fought in the mountains of what is now Ishikawa Prefecture, would become legendary in Japanese military history. The Taira had assembled a large army to crush Yoshinaka's forces, confident in their numerical superiority. But Yoshinaka, displaying the tactical brilliance that made him such a formidable commander, devised a cunning strategy. He positioned his forces in the mountains overlooking a narrow valley where the Taira army would have to pass. As night fell, he ordered his men to drive a herd of oxen with torches tied to their horns, toward the Taira positions. The Taira, seeing hundreds of lights moving toward them in the darkness, believed they were being attacked by a much larger force than they actually faced. In the confusion and panic that followed, Yoshinaka's warriors fell upon the disorganized Taira army. The battle became a rout, with thousands of Taira warriors killed or captured. Many fled in panic, with some even falling from the cliffs in their desperation to escape. Tomoe fought in this battle, and the chronicles record her presence at the forefront of the action. She was, by all accounts, instrumental in the victory, engaging Taira warriors in combat and demonstrating the skill and courage that had made her reputation. The victory at Kurikara opened the road to Kyoto, the Jasai imperial capital, and established Yoshinaka as one of the preeminent military leaders in Japan. Following this triumph, Yoshinaka marched on Kyoto. The Taira, recognizing that they could not hold the capital against his advance, chose to withdraw, taking the child emperor Antoku with them. This was an act of tremendous significance. In the complex political world of medieval Japan, control of the emperor, even a child emperor, conferred legitimacy and authority. By taking Antoku with them, the Taira were asserting that they remained the true power in the land, while also creating a profound crisis of legitimacy. Yoshinaka entered Kyoto in triumph in the summer of 1183, hailed as a liberator who had driven out the oppressive Taira regime. For a brief moment, he stood at the pinnacle of power and prestige. The court honored him with titles and positions, and he was celebrated as a hero throughout the capital. Tomoe, as one of his most trusted warriors, would have been present during this moment of glory, witnessing the culmination of years of struggle and conflict. But Yoshinaka's triumph would prove to be tragically short-lived. The very qualities that had made him such an effective military commander in the mountains and on the battlefield would prove to be liabilities in the refined and subtle world of Kyoto politics. Yoshinaka was, at heart, a warrior from the provinces, more comfortable in a military camp than in the intrigues of the imperial court. His troops, battle-hardened veterans of the mountain campaigns, were ill-suited to garrison duty in the sophisticated capital. Discipline began to break down among Yoshinaka's forces. There were incidents of looting and violence as his soldiers, many of whom had been promised rewards for their service, grew impatient and restless. The aristocrats and courtiers of Kyoto, who had initially welcomed Yoshinaka as a savior, began to view him and his army as crude provincials who were little better than the Taira they had replaced. Food shortages in the capital, exacerbated by the disruptions of war, added to the growing discontent. Meanwhile, Yoshinaka's relationship with his cousin Yoritomo, who controlled the eastern provinces, was deteriorating. Yoritomo, a shrewd political operator as well as a military leader, had been carefully building the foundations of what would become the first shogunate, a military government that would effectively control Japan while maintaining the fiction of imperial authority. He viewed Yoshinaka's independent power base and his position in Kyoto with suspicion and concern. The tension between the two Minamoto cousins grew as Yoshinaka consolidated his position in the capital. Yoshinaka attempted to secure his power by obtaining court appointments and by his association with the cloistered emperor Go-Shirakawa, a wily political survivor who had maintained influence through multiple changes of regime. But these moves only served to increase Yoritomo's suspicions that Yoshinaka might be trying to establish himself as the dominant power in the Minamoto clan. In late 1183, Go-Shirakawa, seeking to play the Minamoto cousins off against each other, sent secret messages to Yoritomo encouraging him to move against Yoshinaka. Whether Go-Shirakawa was genuinely concerned about Yoshinaka's behavior or simply engaging in the kind of political manipulation at which he excelled is a matter of historical debate. What is certain is that Yoritomo needed little encouragement to move against a cousin he had come to see as a rival. Yoshinaka, learning of the ex-emperor's communications with Yoritomo, responded by effectively taking Go Shirakawa hostage in a desperate attempt to maintain his position. This proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. The act was seen as an unforgivable outrage against the imperial dignity, and it provided Yoritomo with the perfect justification for military action against his cousin. In January 1184, Yoritomo dispatched 2 armies to deal with Yoshinaka. One was led by his younger brother, the brilliant warrior Minamoto no Yoshitsune, who would go on to become one of the most celebrated figures in Japanese history. The other was commanded by Noriyori, another Minamoto cousin. These forces, well-equipped, well-disciplined, and numerically superior to Yoshinaka's depleted army, began their march on Kyoto. Yoshinaka's position was now desperate. Many of his warriors had deserted him, either returning to their homes or switching their allegiance to Yoritomo. Food and supplies were running short. The population of Kyoto had turned against him, and even many of his most loyal retainers were counseling surrender or flight. But Yoshinaka, proud and stubborn, refused to yield without a fight. The final confrontation came at the Uji River, south of Kyoto, and at Seita, another strategic crossing point. Yoshinaka divided his remaining forces to defend both locations, but his position was hopeless from the start. Yoshitsune, demonstrating the tactical genius that would make him legendary, found a way to ford the Uji River despite Yoshinaka's defenses, and Yoshinaka's outnumbered warriors were overwhelmed. It is at this moment, in the depths of his defeat, that Tomoe Gozen appears most vividly in the historical record. The most detailed account of her comes from the Heike Monogatari, the great epic chronicle of the Genpei War that was recited by blind storytellers throughout Japan for centuries. This is where we find the famous description of Tomoe. Tomoe was especially beautiful, with white skin, long hair, and charming features. She was also a remarkably strong archer, and as a swordswoman, she was a warrior worth 1,000, ready to confront a demon or a god, mounted or on foot. As Yoshinaka's army crumbled and his warriors fled or fell in battle, Tomoe remained at his side. The chronicles tell us that she continued to fight with extraordinary courage and skill, even as the situation became increasingly hopeless. In one account, she rode into a group of enemy warriors and grappled with one of their leaders, Onda no Hachiro Moroshige, whom she pulled from his horse. She then, according to the chronicle, cut off his head, a feat that would have required tremendous strength and skill. But Yoshinaka, knowing that the end was near and not wishing for Tomoe to die in a hopeless fight, ordered her to leave the battlefield. This command must have been devastating for Tomoe. To flee while one's lord faced death would normally have been considered an unthinkable act of disloyalty for a samurai. But Yoshinaka insisted, and various accounts suggest different reasons for his decision. Some say he did not wish to die in the company of a woman, as it might diminish his reputation in death. Others suggest he genuinely wished to save her life, recognizing her exceptional worth as a warrior and perhaps feeling deeper personal bonds of affection or love. The Heike Monogatari tells us that Tomoe was reluctant to leave, but eventually obeyed Yoshinaka's command. Before departing, she engaged in one final act of valor, seeking out and defeating a formidable enemy warrior to prove her worth one last time. Then she left the battlefield, removing her armor and disappearing from the scene of Yoshinaka's final moments. Yoshinaka himself died shortly afterward. He was attempting to flee across frozen rice paddies when his horse became trapped in the mud. As he struggled to free his mount, enemy warriors caught up with him and shot him with arrows. Knowing he was doomed, Yoshinaka turned his sword on himself, committing seppuku rather than allowing himself to be captured. His death marked the end of his brief but dramatic bid for power and removed one more obstacle in Yoritomo's path to supremacy over the Minamoto clan. And here, Tomoe Gozen vanishes from the clear light of history into the realm of legend and speculation. What happened to this exceptional warrior after she left the battlefield at Uji? The historical record falls silent, but that silence has been filled over the centuries with numerous stories and traditions, each offering a different vision of her fate. One tradition holds that Tomoe became a nun, retiring from the world of warfare and violence to spend her remaining years in religious contemplation. This was not an uncommon path for members of the samurai class who had experienced the horrors of war or lost their lords. The Buddhist monasteries and convents of Japan offered refuge and a chance for spiritual redemption. According to this tradition, Tomoe took religious vows and lived out her days in prayer and meditation, perhaps seeking peace after the trauma of battle and the loss of Yoshinaka. Another more romantic tradition suggests that Tomoe was captured by one of Yoritomo's warriors, Wada Yoshimori, and became his wife. Yoshimori was a powerful warrior in his own right, and this tradition has it that he was so impressed by Tomoe's martial prowess and spirit that he insisted on marrying her. According to this version of her story, Tomoe bore Yoshimori a son and lived a long life as a samurai's wife, though one imagines she must have found it difficult to adjust to a more conventional domestic role after her experiences as a warrior. Yet another tradition places Tomoe in the service of the shogunate established by Yoritomo, suggesting that her skills were too valuable to waste and that she found a place in the new order that emerged from the Genpei War. Some versions of this story have her serving as an instructor in the martial arts, passing on her knowledge and experience to a new generation of warriors. There are even more dramatic legends. Some stories claim that Tomoe never truly left the battlefield, that she continued to fight, either as a wandering warrior monk or as a mercenary, unable or unwilling to give up the life of combat. Other tales suggest she sought revenge against those who had brought about Yoshinaka's downfall, embarking on a solitary campaign of vengeance that eventually led to her own death in battle. The truth is that we simply do not know what became of Tomoe Gozen. The historical sources that mention her at all do so only in the context of her service to Yoshinaka and her actions at the Battle of Uji. After that, she disappears, leaving behind only questions and the various traditions that have grown up around her memory. This uncertainty, rather than diminishing her legend, has perhaps enhanced it, allowing each generation to imagine the ending to her story that resonates most strongly with their own values and concerns. What we can say with certainty is that Tomoe Gozen existed, that she was a warrior of exceptional skill and courage, and that her contemporaries considered her remarkable enough to record her deeds for posterity. In an age when women were rarely mentioned in military chronicles unless they were empresses or regents, Tomoe appears repeatedly in accounts of the Genpei War, described in terms that were normally reserved only for the greatest male warriors. The question of why Tomoe was able to achieve such a prominent role as a warrior is fascinating to consider. Japanese society in the Heian and early Kamakura periods was certainly male-dominated, and women's opportunities were generally more limited than men's. Yet there was a tradition of female warriors that predated Tomoe and would continue, albeit sporadically, after her time. Part of the explanation may lie in the practical realities of samurai life. When warriors were away fighting, someone had to defend the home and family. Women of the samurai class were expected to maintain the household's honor and dignity, which could include taking up arms if necessary. The naginata, the polearm weapon mentioned earlier, was specifically associated with female warriors and would remain so for centuries. Training in the martial arts was considered part of a proper samurai woman's education, even if most women never fought in actual battles. But Tomoe went far beyond this basic expectation. She didn't simply defend the home, she rode out to war alongside the male warriors. She didn't just wield the naginata, she mastered the bow and sword as well. She didn't stay in the rear as a symbolic presence. She fought at the front of battles and engaged in single combat with enemy champions. One possible explanation is that Tomoe was simply so extraordinarily talented that her abilities couldn't be ignored. In a society that placed tremendous value on martial prowess, a warrior of her caliber may have earned acceptance through sheer skill, transcending the normal expectations of gender. Yoshinaka, for his part, seems to have recognized and valued her abilities, giving her a prominent role in his forces despite whatever social complications this may have caused. It's also worth considering that Yoshinaka's army was in some ways outside the mainstream of Japanese aristocratic society. Based in the mountainous regions of central Japan, far from the refined world of the Kyoto court, Yoshinaka's forces may have been more pragmatic and less concerned with social conventions than their eastern or western counterparts. If you had a warrior as skilled as Tomoe in your ranks, why would you waste that asset due to considerations of gender? The nature of warfare in this period may also have been a factor. Battle in 12th century Japan was as much about personal glory and the demonstration of individual prowess as it was about strategic objectives. A warrior who could ride at the head of a charge, engage in single combat, and take enemy heads was enormously valuable regardless of gender. Tomoe's presence may have actually enhanced Yoshinaka's reputation, marking him as a lord who commanded the loyalty of warriors so exceptional that even social conventions bent before their skills. The cultural legacy of Tomoe Gozen has been profound and enduring. The Heike Monogatari, the epic chronicle that records her deeds, was not merely a historical document, but a work of literature that was performed by blind storytellers throughout Japan for centuries. These performers, accompanying themselves on the baiwa, a traditional lute, recited the tale of the Genpei War in homes, temples, and public spaces, keeping the memory of the conflict and its participants alive in the popular imagination. Through these performances, Tomoe became a folk hero, celebrated in song and story. Her image appeared in countless works of art, woodblock prints, paintings, and sculptures. She became a subject for no drama, that refined theatrical art form that emerged in medieval Japan, and later for kabuki, the more popular and dramatic theater tradition. In these performances, Tomoe was portrayed as the ideal of the female warrior, beautiful yet deadly, loyal to her lord, skilled in combat, and ultimately tragic in her fate. During the Edo period, 1603–1868, when Japan was unified under the Tokugawa shogunate and entered a long era of peace, the warrior class gradually transformed from military leaders into bureaucratic administrators. During this time, the legends and ideals of the earlier warrior age took on new significance. Samurai who no longer fought in battles instead studied the history and philosophy of warfare, and figures like Tomoe became exemplars of the warrior spirit. Interestingly, during this period, the image of the female warrior wielding the naginata became firmly established in popular culture and educational practice. Young women of samurai families were trained in naginata technique, and this was justified partly by reference to historical figures like Tomoe. While few women actually fought in the relatively peaceful Edo period, the idea of the female warrior remained culturally significant, representing ideals of courage, loyalty, and the protection of home and family. In the Meiji era, 1868–1912, when Japan underwent rapid modernization and westernization, the question of women's roles in society became a subject of intense debate. Conservatives pointed to figures like Tomoe as examples of traditional Japanese womanhood, strong, loyal, and skilled, yet ultimately serving male authority figures. Reformers, meanwhile, used the same historical examples to argue that Japanese women had historically played active public roles and that restrictions on women's activities were more recent innovations. During World War II, the image of Tomoe and other female warriors was invoked to encourage women's participation in the war effort. Women were urged to emulate the courage and sacrifice of these historical figures, supporting their husbands and sons, and if necessary, defending the homeland. The darker aspects of this appropriation of historical memory are obvious, but it demonstrates the continued cultural power of Tomoe's legend. In the post-war period, and especially in recent decades, Tomoe Gozen has been reclaimed in new ways. Feminists have embraced her as an early example of a woman who refused to be confined by social expectations and who demonstrated that women were capable of excelling in any field, even one as traditionally masculine as warfare. Historical novelists and manga artists have created numerous fictional works featuring Tomoe, each imagining her life and motivations in different ways. Modern scholarship has taken a more critical approach to the Tomoe legend, recognizing the difficulty of separating historical fact from literary embellishment. The Heike Monogatari, while based on actual events, is first and foremost a work of literature, shaped by the aesthetic and ideological concerns of its creators. How much of what it tells us about Tomoe is historical truth, and how much is literary construction? Some scholars have pointed out that the descriptions of Tomoe emphasize her beauty as much as her martial prowess, suggesting that the account may have been shaped by conventional expectations about femininity, even as it celebrated her unconventional achievements. Others have noted that female warriors appear in other Japanese literary works from this period, sometimes as symbolic figures representing various themes rather than as historical individuals. Yet even the most skeptical scholars generally accept that there was a historical Tomoe Gozen, that she was associated with Yoshinaka, and that she participated in the battles of the Genpei War. The question is not whether she existed, but rather how accurately the surviving accounts reflect her actual life and deeds. And in the end, perhaps both the historical Tomoe and the legendary Tomoe are significant. The first as evidence of what was actually possible in 12th century Japan. The second as a testament to the enduring appeal of stories about those who transcend conventional boundaries. From a broader historical perspective, Tomoe's story illuminates important aspects of medieval Japanese society. The Genpei War was a pivotal moment in Japanese history, marking the transition from rule by the imperial court to rule by the warrior class. The shogunate that emerged from this conflict would govern Japan in various forms until 1868, fundamentally shaping the development of Japanese culture and society. The war also marked a shift in the nature of warfare itself. The ritualized individual combat described in accounts of battles like Uji would gradually give way to larger-scale, more organized military operations. The mounted archer, the ideal warrior of Tomoe's era, would eventually be supplemented and then largely replaced by formations of foot soldiers armed with spears and, later, firearms. The age of the individual warrior hero, which had produced figures like Tomoe and Yoshinaka, was beginning to give way to an age of armies and strategy. The fate of Yoshinaka is also worth reflecting upon. He was, by all accounts, a formidable warrior and a capable military leader. His victories at Yokotagawara and Kurikara demonstrated genuine tactical skill, and his ability to inspire loyalty in warriors like Tomoe speaks to his charisma and leadership qualities. Yet he lacked the political sophistication and patience necessary to succeed in the complex world of Kyoto politics. His rise and fall encapsulate a recurring theme in Japanese history: the tension between martial virtue and political cunning, between the straightforward warrior and the subtle courtier. Yoritomo, who ultimately prevailed over both Yoshinaka and the Taira, was a different sort of figure entirely. While capable of military leadership, his real genius lay in political organization and the careful construction of a new system of government. He understood that military victory was not enough. One also needed to build institutions and alliances that could maintain power over time. His establishment of the Kamakura shogunate created a template for military government that would persist for centuries. Yoshitsune, Yoritomo's brother and Yoshinaka's nemesis at Uji, represents yet another facet of the warrior ideal. He was perhaps the most brilliant tactical commander of his age, winning a series of stunning victories against the Taira that finally ended the Genpei War. Yet he too would fall victim to his brother's suspicion and political maneuvering, dying in 1189 after being hunted down by Yoritomo's forces. His fate, like Yoshinaka's, suggests that military brilliance alone was not sufficient for survival in the turbulent world of late 12th century Japan. In this context, what happened to Tomoe after the Battle of Uji takes on additional significance. If the tradition that she survived and found a place in the new order is true, she would have succeeded where both Yoshinaka and Yoshitsune failed, adapting to changed circumstances and finding a way to continue living in a world that had been fundamentally transformed by war. Her disappearance from the historical record might then be understood not as a failure, but as a success, a tactical retreat that allowed her to preserve her life even if it meant giving up her identity as a warrior. The weapons and techniques that Tomoe would have used are worth examining in more detail, as they help us understand the practical realities of her achievements. The Japanese bao, or yumi, was a formidable weapon, typically measuring over 2 meters in length and requiring tremendous strength to draw. Unlike Western bows, which were generally held at the center, the yumi was asymmetric, with the grip about 1/3 of the way from the bottom. This design was partially dictated by the need to use the bow from horseback. The asymmetric design made it easier to shoot from a mounted position. Drawing such a bow required not just arm strength, but the coordinated use of the entire body. The archer would draw the string back past the ear, using the muscles of the back and shoulders as much as the arms. The arrows themselves were long and heavy, capable of penetrating armor at considerable distances. A skilled archer could release several arrows in rapid succession, maintaining accuracy even while their horse was galloping across rough terrain. The sword that Tomoe would have carried was likely a tachi, the precursor to the more famous katana. The tachi was worn edge down, suspended from the belt, as opposed to the katana, which would be worn edge up, thrust through the belt. The swords of this era were already renowned for their quality, the result of sophisticated forging techniques that had been developed over centuries. A good sword was a samurai's most prized possession, often given a name and regarded as having a spirit of its own. For close combat, Tomoe might also have carried a tanto, a short blade that could be used for the grim task of taking enemy heads, proof of victory in battle. The accounts that describe her taking the head of an enemy warrior at Uji were referring to this practice, which was a standard part of samurai warfare in this period. The armor worn by warriors of Tomoe's era was elaborate and beautiful. Known as yoroi, it consisted of small metal or leather plates laced together with silk cord, forming a flexible but protective covering for the body. The helmet, or kabuto, was often adorned with decorative crests. The overall effect was both practical and impressive, designed to protect the wearer while also displaying their status and intimidating enemies. Wearing this armor while riding a horse and engaging in combat required extraordinary physical conditioning. The armor was heavy, and fighting in it was exhausting work. The fact that Tomoe was described as being able to handle the most difficult horses and to fight as effectively as the strongest male warriors suggests a level of physical prowess that would have been remarkable in any era. The horses themselves were smaller than modern war horses, more similar in size to what we would today consider a large pony, but they were bred for strength, endurance, and responsiveness. A warrior's relationship with their horse was crucial. The horse had to be trained to respond to subtle cues, as the rider's hands would be occupied with bow or sword. The bond between warrior and mount was often a close one, developed over years of training and combat. Training to become a warrior of Tomoe's caliber would have begun in childhood and continued throughout adolescence. It would have involved not just physical conditioning and weapons practice, but also the cultivation of mental discipline and the study of strategy. Young warriors were taught to endure hardship, to face fear, and to maintain composure in the face of death. They studied the deeds of great warriors of the past and learned to value honor and reputation above life itself. For a woman to undergo this training and to achieve mastery of these skills would have required not just physical talent, but also tremendous determination and the support of those around her. Someone, whether it was her family, Yoshinaka himself, or others in his circle, must have recognized her potential and provided the opportunity for her to develop it. This suggests that, at least in some contexts, medieval Japanese society was more flexible in its gender roles than we might assume. The psychological dimension of Tomoe's experience is something we can only speculate about, as the historical sources tell us nothing of her inner life. What did it feel like to be a woman in an almost entirely male profession? Did she face discrimination or harassment from male warriors who resented her presence? Or was she accepted as a comrade by those who had seen her skill and courage in battle? Did she ever doubt herself? Or did she possess an absolute confidence in her abilities? The decision to leave Yoshinaka at the Battle of Uji must have been wrenching. For a warrior, loyalty to one's lord was the highest virtue, and to flee while one's lord faced death would have seemed like the ultimate betrayal. Yet she obeyed Yoshinaka's command. Was this because she respected his authority as her lord, because she hoped to survive to avenge him, or because, despite her warrior's training, the human instinct for survival ultimately prevailed? Or perhaps she recognized that Yoshinaka's order gave her permission to do what she wanted to do anyway, to live, to continue, to find a new path forward. If the tradition that she became a nun is true, it raises interesting questions about her spiritual life. Buddhist teachings about the nature of suffering, the transience of worldly glory, and the possibility of enlightenment might have offered her a framework for making sense of the violence she had experienced and participated in. The life of a nun would have been a dramatic change from her warrior existence, but it might have provided a kind of peace that warfare never could. Alternatively, if she did marry Wada Yoshimori or another warrior and lived out her life in a more conventional role, what would that transition have been like? After years of independence and agency as a warrior, how would she have adapted to the more circumscribed life of a samurai wife? Would she have felt confined? Or would she have found satisfaction in different forms of service and different kinds of relationships? The various legends about Tomoe's later life can be read as attempts to imagine satisfying conclusions to her story. The tradition that she became a nun offers spiritual resolution and redemption. The story of her marriage to Yoshimori suggests that she found a new life and perhaps even happiness. The tales of continued wandering and fighting allow her to remain true to her warrior identity to the very end. Each of these endings addresses different aspects of what her story means to those who tell and hear it. What is clear is that Tomoe's legend has served different purposes for different audiences over the centuries. For medieval audiences hearing the Heike Monogatari recited, she represented an example of exceptional loyalty and martial prowess, demonstrating that the warrior virtues could be embodied by a woman as well as a man. For Edo period samurai, she was a historical exemplar whose story could be used to teach moral lessons about duty and honor. For modern audiences, she has become a symbol of female empowerment and the possibility of transcending social limitations. The tension between these different interpretations reflects ongoing debates about gender, power, and social roles. Some feminists celebrate Tomoe as a proto-feminist who refused to accept conventional limitations. Others argue that her story, as it has been preserved and transmitted, ultimately reinforces patriarchal values. After all, her glory came from serving a male lord, and the accounts of her deeds emphasize her beauty as much as her martial prowess. Both perspectives have merit, and perhaps the most honest approach is to recognize the complexity and ambiguity inherent in the historical sources. It's also worth considering Tomoe in the broader context of female warriors across different cultures and time periods. While relatively rare, women warriors have appeared in many societies, from the legendary Amazons of ancient Greece to the real female soldiers who fought in various wars throughout history. Each culture has told these stories differently, shaped by its own values and concerns. In some cultures, female warriors have been portrayed as monstrous aberrations, women who violated natural law by taking up arms. In others, they have been seen as exceptional individuals whose extraordinary abilities allowed them to transcend normal gender roles. In still others, female military participation has been more normalized, seen as unusual but not unthinkable. Medieval Japan seems to have fallen somewhere in the middle of this spectrum. Female warriors were uncommon, but not entirely unknown, remarkable but not necessarily seen as violating the natural order. The fact that Tomoe's story was preserved and celebrated suggests that her contemporaries and immediate successors found her achievements impressive rather than threatening or improper. The question of historical accuracy versus literary embellishment in the Tomoe legend is ultimately impossible to resolve definitively. The Heike Monogatari, our primary source for her story, was composed decades after the events it describes, based on oral traditions and earlier written accounts. It was intended as a work of literature and moral instruction, as much as a historical chronicle. Its descriptions of battles are often stylized, and it includes supernatural elements alongside historical events. Yet the text also contains considerable accurate historical information, and many of the people and events it describes can be verified through other sources. The challenge is determining which elements are historical and which are literary invention. In Tomoe's case, the basic facts, that she was a warrior associated with Yoshinaka who fought in the Genpei War, seem secure. The details of her individual exploits and the dramatic account of her final battle are harder to verify. But perhaps this uncertainty is itself instructive. History is always a construction, a narrative we create about the past, based on incomplete evidence and shaped by our present concerns. The true Tomoe Gozen, the actual person who lived and fought in 12th century Japan, is lost to us. What we have instead are the stories that have been told about her, the meanings that different generations have found in her legend, and the ways her example has inspired and challenged people across the centuries. In recent years, popular culture has embraced Tomoe in various ways. She has appeared in numerous anime, manga, video games, and novels, each offering a different interpretation of her character and story. Some portray her as a stoic, dedicated warrior. Others emphasize her humanity and emotional complexity. Some stick closely to the traditional accounts. Others reimagine her story entirely, placing her in alternative historical scenarios or even fantasy settings. This proliferation of Tomoe stories reflects the continued fascination with her legend, but also raises questions about historical memory and cultural appropriation. When does creative reinterpretation of history illuminate something true about the past? And when does it simply project our own concerns and fantasies onto historical figures who can't speak for themselves? There are no easy answers to these questions, but they are worth keeping in mind as we engage with historical legends like that of Tomoe Gozen. For those interested in the historical study of women in medieval Japan, Tomoe's story is both inspiring and frustrating. Inspiring because it demonstrates that women could achieve remarkable things, even in a male-dominated society. Frustrating because the sources tell us so little about her actual experiences and perspectives. She appears in the chronicles as a warrior, but we know nothing of her thoughts, her relationships beyond her service to Yoshinaka, her childhood, or her ultimate fate. This is, unfortunately, typical of how women appear in medieval historical sources. They are noted when they do something remarkable or when they play crucial roles in major events. But their inner lives, their daily experiences, and their own voices are rarely recorded. We are left to imagine and infer, to read between the lines of sources written by and for men. Modern historians have developed increasingly sophisticated methods for recovering women's history from these fragmentary sources, analyzing not just what is said, but what is not said. Looking for women's agency even in sources that seem to deny it, and being attentive to the ways that gender shaped both historical experiences and historical records. Applied to Tomoe's story, these methods can help us understand not just what she did, but what her actions meant in the context of her society. The enduring appeal of Tomoe Gozen's story, across centuries and cultures, suggests something fundamental about human nature and human aspirations. We are drawn to stories of people who exceed expectations, who demonstrate extraordinary courage and skill, who remain loyal in the face of overwhelming odds. We are especially fascinated by those who transgress boundaries, who do things that were thought impossible for people like them. Tomoe represents all of these things. She was a warrior in an age of warriors, distinguished by her skill even among the most accomplished fighters of her time. She was a woman who excelled in a male profession, demonstrating that gender need not determine one's capabilities or destiny. She was loyal to Yoshinaka through triumph and disaster, standing by him until the very end. And she has remained alive in memory and legend for over 800 years, continuing to inspire new stories and new interpretations. In the end, perhaps what matters most about Tomoe Gozen is not the precise historical details of her life, which we will never fully recover, but what her story represents and how it has been used. She stands as a reminder that people are capable of exceeding the expectations and limitations placed upon them, that courage and skill can emerge from unexpected places, and that history is richer and more complex than simple narratives of male achievement might suggest. As we sit here in our own time, contemplating her story, we might ask ourselves what we can learn from her example. Not that we should all become warriors. That would be a rather literal and impractical interpretation. But rather that we might all seek to develop our capabilities fully, regardless of what others expect of us. That we might face our own challenges with courage and determination. That we might remain loyal to our principles and to those we care about, even when doing so is difficult. We might also reflect on how we remember and tell stories about the past. Tomoe's legend has been shaped by the needs and concerns of each generation that has retold it. What aspects of her story resonate with us today? What do our interpretations of her legend say about our own values and concerns? And how might future generations look back at our time and our stories? The mist-shrouded mountains of medieval Japan, where Tomoe rode into battle so long ago, are gone now, replaced by the modern landscape of contemporary Japan. The castles and temples that witnessed the Genpei War have mostly been destroyed or rebuilt. The very language in which the Heike Monogatari was originally written would be nearly incomprehensible to modern Japanese speakers without specialized study. But the story endures. Tomoe Gozen lives on in memory and imagination, a figure from the distant past who continues to speak to us across the centuries. In the many retellings of her tale, in the artwork depicting her deeds, in the scholarly debates about her historical reality, and in the inspiration she provides to those who hear her story, she remains present and significant. As we bring our contemplation of her life to a close, we can picture her in that moment at the Battle of Uji, engaging in one final act of valor before reluctantly obeying Yoshinaka's command to leave the battlefield. We can imagine her removing her armor, perhaps hiding it somewhere before making her way to safety, and then we can imagine her walking away from that battlefield, leaving behind her life as a warrior, walking into an uncertain future that history has not recorded. Where did she go? What did she do? How did her story end? These questions have no certain answers, but in the very asking of them, we keep her memory alive. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps it is fitting that a woman who transcended so many boundaries in life should also transcend the boundary between history and legend and death, existing forever in that liminal space where fact and story blur together, inspiring each new generation to imagine her life and meaning anew. Tonight, we have talked about Tomoe Gozen, a warrior woman of medieval Japan, a figure who was exceptional in her own time and who remains remarkable in ours. Her story reminds us that history is full of surprises, that human capabilities cannot be neatly categorized, and that sometimes the most interesting historical figures are those about whom we know the least, because they leave space for us to wonder, to imagine, and to find in their stories the meanings we need. As you drift off to sleep tonight, you might picture her riding across those ancient battlefields, bow in hand, fearless and skilled, a woman who refused to be confined by others' expectations. You might imagine the sound of horses' hooves, the whistle of arrows through the air, the clash of steel, and the quiet moments after battle when warriors contemplated the meaning of it all. And in those images and sounds, perhaps you will find the peace and fascination that comes from contemplating lives lived with courage, skill, and determination in times very different from our own. The story of Tomoe Gozen is a gift from the past, a reminder that history is full of remarkable people whose achievements deserve to be remembered and celebrated. As long as her story continues to be told, as long as people are inspired by her example, she lives on, a warrior woman of medieval Japan who conquered not just enemies on the battlefield, but also the limitations of her time, claiming for herself a place in history that no one can take away. And so we close this chapter, This evening's contemplation of a life lived 8 centuries ago in a land across the ocean, yet somehow still vivid and meaningful to us here and now. Rest well, knowing that the human spirit is capable of remarkable things, that courage and determination can triumph over expectation and convention, and that some stories, once told, echo through the ages, never truly ending but living on in each retelling, each reimagining, each moment when someone pauses to remember and honor those who came before. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with the courage and spirit of Tomoe Gozen, the legendary warrior woman of medieval Japan.